You to this event of Does God Make Sense conference. We've had it for a couple of days, beginning yesterday and going through tomorrow. And it's great to see such a crowd here. I don't know how many are believers and how many are heathen. But, no, seriously, I'm just glad that everyone is here. And it was a real pleasure for us to have William and Vince on the radio yesterday morning. I thought it was a really, really good event that we had there, a little discussion on the radio, but we're looking forward to getting more into the whether or not belief has been discredited or not. And so anyway, without further ado, I wanted to introduce Mark Tedford, sponsor and organizer of this event, and let's give him a hand.
Thank you, Eddie. Good evening. Again, my name is Mark Tedford. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Does God Make Sense conference. And as Eddie said, this is a series of 5 events over 3 days. And we're excited about tonight's event, where we're going to discuss the topic, Has Faith in God Been Discredited? First order of business, I'd like to thank our sponsors that made tonight's event possible. FCFM, Tedford Insurance, Regent Bank, EXP Realty, KFAQ, 918 Shuttle, Emerge Interactive, Career Development Partners, RZIM, Atheist Community of Tulsa, and Tulsa Live Events doing our AV tonight. Let's give them a hand. Now, we've intentionally labeled tonight's event as a discussion and not a debate, because debate implies argument and winners and losers. Between the Christian and atheist communities, there's been too little dialogue. And what dialogue there has been has too often been filled with ridicule and contempt. We hope that tonight's event will build bridges between the two communities by showing that disagreement does not mean you have to be disagreeable, and that not all discussions have to have a winner and loser. We think that we should all be friends and treat one another with mutual respect, because the big questions of life press on all of us equally, and none of us are exempted from their implications. The Christian answers to life's big questions are familiar to most of us, and tonight we'll look at whether those answers have been discredited or not. Giving the atheist response will be William Paul of the Atheist Community of Tulsa, and representing the Christian point of view is Dr. Vince Vitale from Rabbi Zacharias International Ministries. The format of tonight's event will include 35 minutes to each presenter, starting with Mr. Paul, and then a time of question and answers. After the question and answer period, we'll have a reception where our speakers will be available for additional dialogue. We ask that you be respectful for the speakers during the presentation and hold your applause to the end. And now I'd like to introduce Mr. Paul. William Paul is a member and former president of the Atheist Community of Tulsa, founder and co-executive director of Free Oklahoma, and Oklahoma regional director for American Atheists. He was indoctrinated into the Christian religion, which he later rejected while studying at Hilldale Free Will Baptist College in Moore, Oklahoma, where he helped lead the Saints to NCAA Division II national baseball title as starting pitcher in 2002. He currently resides in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma with his wife and 3 children. William Paul.
Can you hear me all right? All right. Well, first I would like to thank everybody for coming out to this event tonight. This is a great opportunity to build bridges, and I think that this is an opportunity for us to, thank you. Well, you already, to find some common ground and build upon that which we do agree, to try to have a polite, civil discourse about that, which we do happen to disagree upon. I'd like to thank the atheist community of Tulsa for allowing me to represent them. This is an opportunity I don't take lightly. I really do appreciate it. Of course, I'd like to thank the organizers and the sponsors that Mark listed. Thank you, Mark. Thanks, Vince. And thank you to Michael, everybody, for allowing me to challenge and question my own beliefs, my predispositions, and my presuppositions. But most importantly, I'd like to thank my parents for getting to know each other in the biblical sense that night. 1981. And the space shuttle first launched. Ronald Reagan was elected or sworn in as president, and the greatest band of all time formed that year. But also, that was Metallica, by the way, for those who know. That was the year that I was conceived. But I wasn't supposed to be. You see, my dad worked at Capital Steel, and he was kind of messing around. I don't really know the story. Both my parents had passed away, but as I understand it, he was trying to impress a young lady and doing something with the steels, and a two-ton steel beam fell on his lower extremities. Doctors had to amputate one of his legs. There was permanent nerve damage, and doctors had to surgically reattach his reproductive organs. And they didn't put a very good chance of my conception ever happening. In fact, they told him that he would most likely not have kids. But here I am. On February 24th, 1982, I was born. And my mother considered me a miracle baby. So much so that I didn't come alone. I have a twin brother. So she thought it was twice as miraculous that here's a guy who had a very, very small chance of having a kid. And here we are. We were raised in a religious household as a consequence. Actually, my first name is Isaiah, but I haven't gone by that since I was 5 years old. I don't know why it would happen to change. But I was Isaiah, my brother was Israel. We were raised in a very Christian household, oriented, taught to raised to believe in a God. And I can remember for the 2/3 of my life believing in God. I trusted in God. I could imagine no greater being than God. And I trusted that while my mother suffered through depression, that God would see her through it. And even when she passed away, I took comfort in knowledge that she was in a better place, that she was in a place where there existed no suffering, but there existed free will, the best possible world. I would wear What Would Jesus Do bracelet, and I would remember and quote Bible verses. And now that has all changed. Of course, I look back. I realized that I really wasn't perhaps that miracle baby. I mean, sure, my odds were slim, but that my conception was a possibility precludes miracles, at least in the spiritual sense, as we understand it. And furthermore, I see that my parents were simply trying to make sense of the long runs. They couldn't make sense of how something so improbable could happen, but maybe the doctors were wrong. I also think that they were counting the hits and ignoring the misses. They looked at my conception while ignoring that my father suffered through epileptic seizures for the rest of his life. They saw the good, but they kind of ignored the bad, and they called that a miracle. And maybe it was. I don't know. But again, for 2/3 of my life, God made sense to me, and he doesn't any longer. And you just heard me introduced as an agnostic atheist, probably just as an atheist, but I am an agnostic atheist, and we'll talk about what that is here in a little bit. I'm sure some of you have probably formed some assumptions about it, and I find that there's no real reason to do that, because by identifying as an atheist, there's nothing by which you can infer about me. It's a non-descriptor. It'd be like me calling you a non-Muslim if you're a Christian. It tells you nothing about what I do believe. And hopefully tonight I'll be able to talk a little bit about what I do believe. But I'm here to challenge myself, to challenge my own beliefs and to question my assumptions. And I want you to question me. I want you to question every authority, and I want you to question everything, because no belief is so sacred that it cannot be questioned. So, what happened? Why am I here as an atheist? I began asking questions. When I was attending Hillsdale Free Will Baptist College, I wanted to reach out to the non-theistic community. And this is the days before Facebook and MySpace. Gosh, I feel old right now. But Yahoo Chat, religion section. And I would go into this Yahoo Chat and I would try to engage them. Back in the day, boy, it was hard to find an atheist. They were closeted. So you had to go to these sections. And I found myself that I was ill-equipped to give an answer to every man that asked me a question about the hope that I had. And I'm sure that perhaps many of you are. I hope that you listen to Vince and Michael today, and I hope you can learn something. I want you to be like them. I want you to be ready. But of all the questions I had to ask when engaging them was, what is an atheist? Now, one of the important things for me to understand at this time, when I'm engaging with these atheists, again, I said I felt ill-prepared. What I decided I needed to do was to, in order to better defend my faith, I had to understand from where the atheist was coming. I had to be prepared, and I had to understand what kind of questions. I had to understand their arguments. I had to understand my weaknesses, the weaknesses of my position. This is what you do. It makes sense when you go out in the military world. You need to know, and I don't mean this in the bad term, know your enemy. I don't want you to think of me as an enemy, but you have to know the opposition. And so that's what I found myself doing. I first needed to understand what an atheist was. In short, an atheist is a non-believer just like you. We are all atheists. Again, I say that the term atheist is a non-descriptor. Even though every Christian in this room knows what it's like to not believe in God. We both know what it's like to not believe in the God of Islam. We both know what it's like to not believe in its authority, the Quran. And some of us has never really given the Islamic God much consideration, but some of us have asked tough questions and simply cannot make sense of the language of the codified oral traditions believed to be the literal words of Allah as revealed to Prophet Muhammad. And of course, this isn't the only God in whom neither of us believe. There are literally thousands of gods created and worshipped by humanity. There we go. Now, think of all these gods ever created by mankind. And this isn't even a full list. That's just what I could fit on the screen. I don't know if you can read that. What's going on here? Neither of us believe in any of these gods. The difference between you and me is that I simply go one further. And for the same reasons you reject all of these gods, I reject yours. So that's the first point I wanted to make, is that we are both alike in a lot of senses. We're both asking the same questions. And we're just not finding the answers, perhaps. So let's consider some of the cognitive mechanisms that we all possess. We all possess a theory of mind. We recognize that we have a mind. And based upon the reciprocal nature of social interaction, as observed in joint attention, language, and the understanding of our emotions and intentions, we assume that we have, by analogy, minds just like you. I assume from my experience that you have a mind very similar to mine. We are 80% biologically the same. So I'm trusting that you probably have the same questions, desires, emotions as I do. And with this, we can attribute thoughts and desires and intentions to others and predict and explain their actions and hopefully posit their intentions. Now, our minds are not condemned to consider and represent only what is currently ongoing in our immediate environment. Our minds possess the ability to decouple in cognition at any point in time. Right now, as I'm talking, some of you are probably thinking, did I leave the oven on? Did I forget to lock the door? You can imagine things. You can have a conversation with an unseen other right now in your heads, even while I'm speaking. And you can imagine what it's like to be in the future at a given time. You can hold a conversation with an unseen other, like Thomas Jefferson. Even though he doesn't exist, you know somewhat of his attitudes based upon what he's left behind. And you can carry on a conversation. We also have an inclination to presume the purposeful intervention of a sentient or intelligent agent in situations that may or may not involve such. We are more likely to assume or mistake a shadow for a burglar, but never the other way around. When we hear a loud noise, we always presume that there is an intelligent agent behind it. Why is this important? Because evolutionary psychologists have proposed these deistic predispositions could be co-opted byproduct of these cognitive mechanisms, and as well as some others. There's some other theories I haven't mentioned, but they're relevant, but like the attachment mechanisms, cognitive closures. But that our abilities to infer the presence of organisms that might do harm and to imagine some sort of causal narrative for these natural phenomena, and to recognize that people have minds of their own with their own beliefs and desires and emotions, allowed us to imagine purposeful agents acting upon the world, acting upon the natural world. For example, these are some of the books I would recommend. Lightning, thunder, we had no idea about what was causing that. Humanity gave it a God. We couldn't explain earthquakes. We created gods to explain floods. This is the flood tablet, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which some biblical scholars believe was thrown into the Bible mix. We try to explain the diversity of languages. This is the spell of Enki, the Sumerian account, which closely resembles the Tower of Babel. The creation of the earth and heavens. This is Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth. The motion of the planets. This is hard with that clicker. Tides. So by the existence of thousands of gods, we know that humans have a capacity and tendency to create gods in order to make sense of the world in which they otherwise couldn't. This is a way of taking something that they believe to be true of the world and concluding God. But this is very much a top-down approach. This doesn't help us to understand what God is. This is a way of saying, if this is true about the world, then this must be true about God. But again, this is somewhat of a backwards, a reverse way of doing things. And I was asked to answer a couple of questions. Does God make sense initially? And I'm sorry to say that the majority of the bulk of my presentation will focus around this, and we'll get to the second question later. Things change. But anyways, but this question itself begs more questions. For one, what do we mean by God? And what do we mean by make sense? So let's start by defining God. This is the God in whom I believe. God is the uncaused, immutable, maximally great sum total of existence who, in his desire for both a filial relationship with his creation and their learning of the truth of his existence and the means of salvation, had condescended to them as the incarnation of Jesus Christ and provided them an authority and a mind so that we could make sense of it. Now, a maximally great being refers to the classical God, the classical attributes, omniscience, omnipotence, and moral perfection. Filial means a parent to child, the kind of relationship with the father to the son, that as his creation, he wants to love us like his children. And what I mean is by he wants all people to be saved and come to knowledge of the truth is 1 Timothy 2:4. And by, of course, authority, we mean the Bible. This is the Judeo-Christian God of the canonized Bible, of whom I once believed. So what does it mean to make sense? It means to be intelligible, justifiable, or practicable. Or in other words, able to be understood, comprehensible, able to be shown to be right or reasonable and defensible, and able to be done or put into practice successfully. And I'm hoping that Vince and Michael can show this for the sake of many of you Christians out there. I'm sure they'll do a tremendous job doing this. I'm just giving you my presentation. So how do we go about making sense of the world? A number of ways, and for the sake of brevity, I'll keep it limited to that which I think is most important to this topic of discussion. We interpret the surrounding environment by processing odor molecules, vibrations, chemicals, and information that is contained in visible light to help us make sense of the world. And our sense perception is perhaps the most immediate way of coming to knowledge, and our primary way of interacting with and understanding the world. Before our parents taught us how to think and how to communicate through language, before we could memorize what they taught us, before we could reason, before we could appeal to our emotions or have any sort of control over them, we are able to make sense of the world through our perceptions. And these are the traditional senses that most of us share. Now, take a moment to think of all the things you're perceiving right now. Right now, you can see me gesturing. Most of you can, I hope. You can hear me talking. You could probably smell the perfume or cologne of the person next to you. And if you're sitting next to my twin brother, you'll probably smell a combination of volatile sulfur compounds at some point. And he looks just like me, so you've been warned. But it's safe to say that much of our knowledge comes to us through these sense perceptions, but it is a complex process. The way that we experience the world may be determined in part by the world, but we are responsible as much of how we interpret that. We don't accept things all the time as they actually are, but sometimes we accept things passively. We know that our perceptions are not perfect. A and B look different. This is an optical illusion, but in fact, they are the same. This is our minds playing tricks on us. So we need to ask ourselves, how good are we at understanding the world through perceptions? Furthermore, emotions can actually affect our perception of reality. Our results show that emotion and perception are not fully dissociable, and the mind, fear can alter even basic aspects of how we perceive the world around us. So we need to question even our own perception, even though it forms the basis of my assumptions. I exist, and that sometimes my perceptions get it right. By appealing to the knowledge of others, we can come to make sense of the world. In fact, much of what we know to be true has come about through specialized knowledge in others. Examples of authority begin with our parents or guardians. Children are mentally predisposed to believing what their parents teach them naturally and accept what they say as true. But there are, of course, others with reliable information to whom we can appeal and question. For example, Einstein is an authority in physics, and he showed us that gravity is really just a curvature of space-time. An authority of his was, among others, Sir Isaac Newton, and so on. We can build on the knowledge of others to make sense of the world. But one thing we need to consider is that while authorities can be correct about a great many things, they can be incorrect about a few things. And so we need to question our authorities. One of the things as a free thinker is that we do our best to appeal to logic, reasoning, empiricism, and question. We do our best to not appeal to authorities, but there are sometimes we have to. I do not have the wherewithal to take an atomic clock up into space and measure time dilation. But I trust that science has got it figured out, and I trust their authority. Now, had Einstein never questioned Newton, we would not have a better understanding about the fundamental laws of the universe. Sorry, this is difficult trying to... Okay, next one, please. And so, we should always question... Okay, well, that's fine. There we go. We should always question, and when possible, test the claims made by authorities before accepting as true. Otherwise, it is simply dogma. Even the Bible says, test everything that is said, hold on to what is good. We use a system of words and signs to express thoughts and feelings to each other so that we can make sense of the world. How much of you make sense of the world existence of everything usually depends upon language. For example, because Einstein expressed his intuitive knowledge about the universal language, we understand that space-time are really interwoven into one space-time continuum through which all motion is relative. And in fact, most of everything that you understand and know about Jesus or the God of the canonized Bible, whether you believe him to be real or a concept used to help explain the natural phenomenon, has come about through language. You were not born with this innate knowledge, but somebody told you. Furthermore, linguistic relativity holds that the structure of language affects the ways its respective speakers conceptualize and make sense of the world. That differences in language structure affect the role in how we partition and remember many events, and they shape the way that we think about space, time, and colors. Therefore, language is an important way in how we make sense of the world. And by encoding and storing and retrieving information that we receive, we can make sense of the world. Our memories of the essence of who we are, the skills we have acquired, the knowledge we have amassed, and the personal experiences we have defined as individuals. And every day, we use our memory to help us go throughout the day. We can recall logical axioms. We can recall that fire is bad. We use this to help us make sense of the world. Now, one thing that's... Go ahead. If pain, joy, excitement, or any other strong emotion is present during an event, you have a greater chance of remembering that event. But as with every other function of our consciousness, is not entirely reliable. In his book, The 7 Sins of Memory, psychologist Daniel Schafter notes on how our memories can fail us. Decreasing accessibility of memory over time, lapses of attention and forgetfulness, temporary inaccessibility of stored information. We have suggestibility. People can actually suggest something to you and it can stick even though it's not necessarily true. A lot of people take advantage of this. There's a lot of propaganda. One of these ways is it's called source amnesia, where they just simply posit the question out there, but for some reason you tuck it away and you accept it's true and you think you remember it accurately. Next one, please. Our current feelings and worldview distort remembrance of past events. And this was a part of a study that I showed, or at least maybe I skipped that slide. Sorry, or I think I have the wrong card, so I'm sorry. Unwanted recollections that people can't forget. And for the most part, I think we can trust our memories, but there are times that we can misattribute memories to incorrect sources, believing the perception is not experienced. Emotion. We use physical signals of the body reacting to external stimuli when our brain interprets the feelings and makes sense of the world. We are constantly inundated with an abundance of external stimuli, and we cannot process all this information cognitively. So our brain is able to do this. Now, emotion is not the best way of acquiring sense of the world. It's not entirely sophisticated, but what it lacks in sophistication, it makes up for in speed and utility. And when these emotions are triggered in the brain, our nervous system responds by creating feelings. And from an evolutionary standpoint, they were viewed as adaptive responses to our recurrent environmental situations. Now, you are likely aware of fear-mongering, the use of fear to influence opinions of others towards a specific end. And from various things, we see it out in propaganda, we see it in politics, we see it in commercials, telling you that if you don't buy this product, something bad will happen. What we have to recognize is that emotions can affect how bad we make decisions. The reason it works is because they play into one of our very most primal emotions. Succumbing to fear can help us lead us to accepting things about reality which are not true. So while emotions are a good way of making sense of the world, they're not entirely perfect, and we should question them. Imagination is a way of making sense of the world without the aid of our senses. It affords us an extraordinary capacity in understanding abstract concepts, ideas, or phenomena. Progress in scientific research is due largely to provisional explanations which are devoted and developed by imagination. Einstein, who I pictured here, had to use his imagination in order to conceive of the space-time continuum. So imagination allows us to form images, sensations, and abstract ideas that are not perceived by other senses, such as numbers or even deities. An example of how some philosophers employ their imagination along with logic in an attempt to reason about God can be seen in the form of the ontological argument. And lastly, and this isn't all the ways which make sense of the world, but this is 35 minutes and I'm trying to get through here. We comprehend and infer received information to form judgments by applying logic in order to make sense of the world. Our ability to reason is a definitive characteristic of human nature. Whereas logic is a particular system of codified models of the principles of proof and proper inference, the act of reasoning is a process of using this model in order to make sense of perceptions and thus the world. We have what we call logical absolutes. And these are the law of non-contradiction, law of the excluded middle, and the law of identity. These describe the laws of nature, the nature of existence. And this is basically what reasoning is. This is what logic is based upon. So remember that we had a top-down approach which said, if this is true about the world, then this must be true about God. What I want to ask is, if this is true about God, then what must we see about the world? And if we define God as I defined him earlier, we should ask, what should we see? So let's begin with perception. Can God be seen or heard? And I would answer no. And this is important to me because if we presuppose a God who gave us the ability to perceive the world around us in order to make sense of things, so that we can make sense of him and come to a filial relationship with him, why can we not see him? Why can we not perceive God? But yet, Curiously, the Bible gives us conflicting answers to this question. We are told in numerous passages that God has appeared before men, that they have seen him, and that they've interacted with him, that they've been able to wrestle and talk once a month. So let's appeal to that Christian authority here. But before we do so, we need to come and ask, what will we expect to see? To a monotheist, the only rational explanation for these thousands of gods is that they have to be the creation of mankind. They can't all be correct. But the one thing I noticed and asked myself a long time ago, and I had to come to this conclusion, that they all could be wrong. So that's the only way. I mean, I suppose you could say that the devil created these to help us, to confuse us. But then how would we know the difference? How would we know that the devil didn't tempt us into believing that the Judeo-Christian God of the canonized Bible is the correct God, and there's some other God we should be worshiping? Well, we should test it. But first, we need to understand what the Bible is and how it came about. Modern biblical scholarship and textual criticism paint a much different picture than what most of you have come to understand about the Bible. The evidence shows that contrary to popular belief, we simply don't know who wrote many of the books in the Bible. In some cases, no authors are named at all. And in others, names of important figures were falsely ascribed to the letters given to their theological views weight. There is evidence of redactions and interpolations, forgeries, people adding content and removing it. There are mentions of other books which don't even appear in the Bible. So in essence, the Bible is a collection of books of various testimonies. Now, when you're dealing with testimonies, it would serve you well to know to whom you are reading. Who is this person? Because that's the integrity of this person ought to be important. Because unlike certain treatises, like if you were to read something on mathematics or logic where the inference can be applied directly from reading it, we have to trust this person. And yet we don't know many times who that person is. Let's begin with the first 5 books of the Old Testament, from whence we have the aforementioned inconsistencies of whether or not God can be seen. While Christian doctrine holds that Moses penned these books, we have good reasons to doubt this claim. For one, nowhere in the Pentateuch does it say that Moses wrote it. Some verses are attributed to him, and some say that he wrote things down, for example, the 10 Commandments. However, nothing internally says that he wrote it. For example, secondly, their internal evidence precludes single authorship. There includes doublets. For example, we have 2 creation myths. We have 2 flood stories. We have 2 of many. We have Genesis, let's see, we've got about 6 doublets that I recorded here. These are the formations of why people preclude single authorship. There are stylistic differences. According to authorities in biblical criticism, the Pentateuch contains many variations of style ranging from preference for particular words or phrases to peculiarities of grammar and syntax. So Moses could not have written about his own burial and death. The frequent use of unto this day occurs frequently. Deuteronomy 2:22, 3:24, and 34:6, indicating that the things which were being written about and reported happened long after the events. There are other examples. This account was placed immediately. For example, Judges 18:27-29 depicts the name change of Laish to Dan. The account is placed immediately after the death of Samson. Moses died more than 200 years before. So these are the anachronisms for which biblical scholars give us the JEPD account. This original hypothesis was formed in the 18th and 19th century in an attempt to reconcile these inconsistencies in the biblical text. We have the Yahweh source, which gives an anthropomorphic descriptions and personal visits from Yahweh. The Elohim source, which is a more generic word for the deity. The Deuteronomy source, which has been composed around 650 and 621 BC, before the Babylonian exile. And the priestly source, which portrays Yahweh as a God who is interested in rituals and depicts a formal structure in terms of space and time. Okay, now. Some Christians will argue that you can accept the JEPD theory and still be a Christian, and I would be happy to oblige, but I'm just saying, knowing this is what gave me cause for alarm because of the picture it paints. When scholars date the sources of these, and we had the dates up above, it shows the evolution of Yahweh from a mere warrior god among a Canaanite pantheon of polytheistic gods who would interact with his people, who would talk with them. And we see this evolution of a god until the point when he became a monotheistic almighty God. We see in Psalm 82:1-2, which reads, God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of gods, he holds judgment. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? And it is clear that God is upbraiding the gods for this injustice. Comparative religion author Karen Armstrong details this evolution in her best-selling book, A History of God, which I would encourage everybody to read. This phenomenon is known by biblical scholarship as pseudepigraphy, or in layman's terms, forgery. While some authorities in biblical criticism contend that 1 Peter is not written by 1 Peter, basically because according to Acts 4:13, he's described as illiterate. And yet 1 Peter is written in highly classical, highly educated Greek. We have no reason to believe that he wrote it, but assuming he did, we have ever more reason to dismiss that he wrote 2 Peter. For one, it was a later epistle than Peter. It is very closely tied with Jude, a 2nd century document. The vocabulary of 1 Peter has only 153 words in common with 2 Peter, while 443 are unique to 1 Peter and 399 unique to 2 Peter. So the majority of biblical scholars agree that 2 Peter is at the very least a forgery. It's not correctly attributed to Peter. And for many of the same reasons, the aforementioned reasons I gave, about 80% of scholars, according to Felix Just, agree that at least 4 of Paul's epistles were not authored by him, given the same explanations. Now, this is a problem for me, or at least this was a problem for me, because if we don't know who's talking, if we don't know who's telling us this information, if we don't know the identity of who's giving the testimony, we can't trust them. There's some 180,000 words in the New Testament, and yet the surviving handwritten copies of the manuscripts show 400,000 variations among them. For example, I'm sure many of us are familiar with the adulterer pericope. It's the great story that many of us can remember. It's from where it gets the English idiom phrase, to cast the first stone, where the Pharisees are condemning a woman who is accused of adultery, and they were going to stone her, and he asks them, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. And they depart, and he tells her, go and sin no more. But yet this is not found in the oldest and best manuscripts we have, in either the Codex Sinaiticus or Codex Sinaiticus. And if Jamie Coots, the man who passed away 3 weeks ago from handling snakes, if he was aware that what he was appealing to was a longer added portion to the book of Mark, he might still be alive today. This is the most commonly debated, well, I wouldn't call it forgery, but interpolation, which is the only clear reference to the Trinity in the Bible. This is 1 John 5:7-8. Now, there are other close mentions, like 2 Corinthians 13:13, but for whatever reason, some author around the 15th century decided to add this in manuscripts. Some of you who have the KJV version of your Bible, you will see this, but other versions do not have it, like the NIV. And in fact, if you want to look up the differences between the two, if you want to look up all the variations and the additions, all you have to do is compare the NIV and the KJV because they use different sources. But we don't know how far back this goes. How many people were adding and subtracting? How do we know that somebody is not miscommunicating an idea about a misremembered event, about something that was misperceived? Let's go and skip the next view. I think I'm running quick on time. Basically what this is, I'm sorry, but I think I'm running low on time. But what this is, and you're good right there. We'll pick up from there. What I was showing you was 1 John, but I'm trying to catch up here. Where are we at? The Bible states very clearly that Jesus would return within the lifetime of his followers and judge every man according to his works, and yet this hasn't happened. And obviously, people have given their reasons for this. I just simply don't buy it. It was believed, even at that time, that this would occur. We knew that the church was aware of this because in 2 Peter, one of the reasons why we know this, it's not written by Peter, is because it's referencing what the church was going through at that time. They were trying to offer words of encouragement to those who were wondering. There were scoffers. So that's one of the ways which we know. So they believed it. I believed he was returning, but I didn't know just how dire Jesus was making this out to be, that he would return within the lifetime of his followers. Some of the other problems I have with this authority is that it sanctions slavery. It tells us how badly you can beat them, how you can sell them, how you can pass it on to your children, let them inherit it. This authority tells us that tornadoes like the one which hit more last year, earthquakes, droughts, and tsunamis and fires are really the cause of God's burning wrath, and not just natural causes. This is why I say that I believe that gods were created to help us make sense of the world. Consistent with the cosmological view of the Hebrews at the time, it suggests that the earth is flat and fixed at the center of the universe, with the planets and stars circling around us. The Genesis 1 account conflicts with the order of events and the timescales known to science. 6 literal 24-hour days. I understand a lot of people don't take this literally anymore, but they did. These views were consistent with what they believed at the time. And to me, it shows that they were creating a God and creating a religion in order to help them make sense of the world, which gives us the creation account. It tells us that insects have 4 legs. We have, of course, the contradictory accounts between the two, as if they weren't wrong enough. But what we know is that the sciences completely disregard these as nothing but mythical tales. And I hope that many of you can as well. The Bible says in 1 Corinthians 14:33 that God is not the author of confusion. But the Bible is a confusing, vague, internally inconsistent book filled with basic factual errors about reality and interpolations, forgeries and possibilities, and a self-serving version of humanity distorted by the authors to lend credence to their religious and theological views. It cites books found nowhere else in the Bible by which we can verify it cannot possibly be the product of an all-loving, all-knowing, all-powerful God who's trying to convey his message to us so that we can make sense of it. Because it itself is so flawed. If there is indeed an objective truth, I contend there is nothing in the Bible which can possibly confirm or deny what that truth is. And if God had such an important message to deliver me that I may come to know him, so that I could come to make sense of him and be saved from what he's going to do to me if I don't let him save me, why would he allow people to change his words? Why did he not preserve his message from redactions, from some false prophet's pen? Why did he convey his message to people in the same way that every other god of humankind which has ever been created by man did? Of all the revealed religions, how is this one any different? Could not have he come up with a better idea? Perhaps in a time when we had the printing press, or when we had YouTube or video cameras. If the Bible is literal, then it is an absurd and self-contradictory. It is figurative, then it is open to as many equally valid interpretations with no way of knowing which one is right. And if it is both, then how do we know which passages are to be taken literally, and how do we know which ones are to be taken figuratively? And this is not a casual question because societies have gone to war over these. And yet we are told by the Yahweh source that he understands just how important language is. We are told that when the Almighty, all-knowing, and ever-present monotheistic God, who is not the author of confusion, came down from the solid dome in the sky and learned that the people of Shinar were building a tower, that he confused their language. He didn't take away their building material. He didn't confuse their reasoning. He confused their language. So even according to the Bible, God knows how important language is to making sense of the world. Now, if I'm a structural engineer in charge of designing a bridge, I will take great pains to ensure that nothing is left ambiguous. Every bolt will have its place, every steel beam will be precisely measured. If I draft these designs in watercolors and poetic and metaphorical language, would any of you drive on this bridge? And yet, this is precisely how I view the Bible. Imagine if this is how we design bridges, by figurative and poetic languages. Now, there are instructions in the Bible which would seem equally absurd to the ones above for building the bridge, and yet some people believe and follow them. And at times, we've been able to come to our senses and rationalize and realize that we shouldn't burn witches, that we shouldn't stone homosexuals, that we should treat women equally. But it took us reason. We didn't get this from the Bible. And by the Bible's own instruction, I have tested as much as I can of it, and I've found it unconvincing. But with that said, I want to take a minute to hold on to that which is good. And I wanted to point out a few things. That we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are some beautiful things about the Bible. And I want to make this point quite clear. That as a former Christian, I think Jesus had some wonderful things to say. I just simply do not think that he's divine. But I can't help but appreciate a guy who is revolting against the state religion of his time, who's challenging him, because he reminds me of me. He had a lot of good things to say. So I did want to let you know, I'm not trying to attack your beliefs, and I'm not trying to attack your Savior. I just simply cannot make sense of God. God is love. 1 John 4:8. If this was the only way that you describe God, I would not be an atheist. I would be a believer. As a father, I know what it's like to love a child. I know what it's like to not want to see them suffer. And I would be willing to die for them. And I know that right now, you're looking at me and you're saying, this is what Jesus has done for you. But I can't make sense of that. But I think I could make sense of the concept of God and understanding this filial relationship. But every 10 seconds, a child dies of starvation. And every minute there are 25 people who will die because they do not have clean water to drink. Every hour, 700 people die of malaria. Many of whom will, in accordance to your beliefs, suffer eternity in torment of hellfire because they were raised in the wrong location and did not hear the gospel. Or because they did hear the gospel and they could not make sense of such an indifferent God who would allow them to suffer and die unnecessarily. Now, if you are more offended by the fact that I am questioning your God's integrity than you are the fact that by the time I complete the sentence, a child will suffer and die unnecessarily, then I think we have a serious problem with our views and how we view morality. I think we are all good people and we have empathy. But I can't imagine a God allowing this to go on. And maybe it's me. Maybe it's that I'm the flawed one. And I know that that's what you're going to tell me, that I'm flawed. And again, I readily admit my senses aren't perfect. I'm starting from two basal assumptions. I exist, and I assume that my perceptions are sometimes correct. But I can't make sense of this. Many of us have experienced intense suffering in our lives. And I watched my mother suffer for years. For 13 years of my life. I've suffered through my own hardships, and I'm sure many of us have. I watched a friend of mine's daughter suffer and die at the age of 2 from leukemia. James 4:17 reads, if anyone then knows the good that they ought to do and doesn't do it, is a sin for them. Where is God? in all of this. I readily admit, Vince, where you at, buddy? This is where I'm hoping you come at me with some good stuff. I know that Vince here, I checked him out. He touches on this subject. I'm here to learn, brother. Bill Nye said that everyone you will ever meet knows something you don't know. I'm hoping that he can help me make sense of this. But of all the deities ever invented by mankind throughout our existence, an indifferent or non-omnipotent beings would be the completely compatible with the world that we observe. But with an all-knowing God, I can't make sense of this. If your child was suffering, would you do everything within your limited power to prevent it? And I think that Vince would make a case. We're up bad on time? Okay. 10 minutes over? 15. You're kidding me. God doesn't make sense. Okay. I'm sorry. Let me go ahead and conclude. The gist of what I wanted to point out was that if there is a God, I cannot make sense of it. And this is honestly with my best attempts. Now, please give me just 3 more minutes. What I want to say to you is that perhaps this is a failing on my part, but this is where you come in as Christians. I don't mind it when you come and talk to me about God. I really don't. But I want you to know, I want you to be prepared to give an answer to every man that asks you a question about the hope that you have with gentleness and respect. I want you to be like Vince. I want you to be like Michael. I want you to be like Mark. But it's going to have you questioning your religion. Because one of the things I can appreciate is that they appreciate from me is that they know what I've been through. And I'm sorry to have taken up so much of your time, but I want you to question. No belief is so sacred that it cannot be questioned. And I'm sorry there was a lot I didn't get to cover, but I hope that we can talk about it during a dialogue and during the Q&A. And if you do question with honest sincerity, one of 2 things will happen. Either you will remain a non-believer to the thousands of gods in which neither you nor I believe, but you will be better equipped to give an answer to every man, and your conviction in this one God will become stronger, or you'll realize that not believing in this one God is no different than not believing in the thousands of other gods ever created by mankind. And should that happen, I will let you know that the atheist community of Tulsa will provide you with a home, a place, a sense of community. And American atheists will fight to defend your civil liberties. And I wanted to thank you all. I love you all. Let's build this dialogue. The questioning and the dialogue does not stop here. Thank you so much for your time. I love you all.
Thank you, Roy, for that presentation. With no further ado, I want to invite Dr. Vince Vitale to come up. Dr. Vitale is a senior tutor at the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics, a member of the Faculty of Theology and Religion at the University of Oxford, and a speaker for RZIM Europe. He holds a doctorate in philosophy and a master's in theology from the University of Oxford. He played varsity soccer at Princeton and was awarded blues in football and boxing at Oxford, and has traveled with Athletes in Action soccer teams to 4 continents. Let's welcome Dr. Vince Vitale.
Well, it's great to be here with you all. Great to see so many friendly faces here. It's even good to see the rest of you as well. Just give me a second. I'm gonna like to move around a little bit. Great, that'll work. First, just to say thanks, Jay Stevens, Mark, Tedford, Cherie, many others, putting this event on. I think Mark said it so right. We need to be in these situations where we can be dialoguing with one another, and Will said it right as well. I know personally for myself as a Christian, I've learned a ton about my faith and about God from atheists and from agnostics. inclined to think I've learned nearly as much as I've learned from Christians because it's atheists, it's agnostics, it's people who believe in other gods who have challenged me about my beliefs, and that's what's actually refined my beliefs and helped me to know God in a more robust way, I hope. So we agree about a lot, I think, Will and I. We agree, first and foremost, that these questions are really significant. We're both against indifference when it comes to these questions. In that sense, we agree. We also agree about the question, I think, for this evening. Has belief in God been discredited? I think, in a significant sense, we agree that the answer is no. Will himself would say he's an agnostic atheist, in the sense that he's not trying to say he has some sort of foolproof argument that God does not exist, but he hasn't been shown arguments positive and strong enough to convince him that God exists. But I think, has belief in God been discredited? I think the answer is no, and I'll try to share why I think that's the case. We also agree that there's a good number of serious objections to Christian faith, to any faith. Will's spoken about a number of objections to the Bible in particular. I won't have time to deal with all those objections here. Maybe I'll just say a bit about why, even though I have far more questions now as a Christian than I did before I was a Christian about the Bible. That doesn't shake my faith. I was in India a couple years ago with Michael Ramsden, and when we got off the plane, horns were beeping everywhere. I don't know if some of you maybe have been to India before, but they were just horns. It was 4 in the morning, I think, 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning, and there were horns beeping everywhere. And I, from New York, immediately thought this is an angry culture. Because when you hear horns beeping in New York, it means that someone's angry at you, and they're probably making a gesture with one of their fingers as well. So I had this assumption this must be an angry culture. It took me another 36 hours or so to realize that on the back of the trucks in India, it would say, "Please beep horn." That was just the way that they alerted people to the fact that they were coming on the left or they were coming on the right. It was an act of politeness in that culture, but I took it to mean that this was a really angry culture. My point is that even in my own century, in a globalized world, if I travel to a different culture, I can have some real difficulty understanding the meaning of things. And when we look at a text that's 2,000 to 3,000 years old, we're talking about a text which is written in a very different culture and at a different time. And part of what I've found is that as a Christian, I started out with a really long list of things about the Bible that didn't make sense to me, apparent inconsistencies, things that seemed like morally they just could not be accurate. There are still things on that list that I can't explain, but my experience has been that that list has gotten smaller and smaller as I've done more and more research, and I've found that the better I understand the context in which the Bible was written, the more sense it makes to me. So that's just in a general sense to say why I continue to put a great deal of trust in the Bible, despite the fact that I can't answer every question that I might have about it. It wasn't always the case for me that I had that trust in the Bible. I wasn't a believer in God when I got to university. It was in my first year of undergraduate that I opened the Bible for the first time, began to read through it as an interested but skeptical philosophy student, and I would add things and cross things out, and I'd write BS in the margins next to the portions that I disagreed with. And Christians would sort of look over my shoulder and say, "Why do you have a BS in the margin of your Bible?" And I'd say, "Oh yeah, that verse makes for a great Bible study." Things changed for me because as I continued to read the Bible, even though I still had lots of questions, I couldn't help but admire the person of Jesus. This is another point where I think Will and I agree. I began to think that he had lived the most beautiful life ever lived. I began to think that he was a man worth following. But I just didn't think Christianity could be true. I assumed that smart people somewhere had discredited belief in God. But all these Christians that I was meeting, they were telling me there's reason for this, that there's evidence And they were pointing me to places in the Bible where people were praised not for blind faith, but for examining what they were being told every day to determine if those things were true. So I began to look into it, and what I found was that far from my initial assumption, belief in God had not been discredited, far from it. If you go back 50 or 60 years, things would have been somewhat different, perhaps. In the first half of the 20th century, academic philosophers, were quite suspicious about claims about God and belief in God, which makes it even more remarkable to be able to say today that the largest special interest group in all of academic philosophy is the Society of Christian Philosophers. There's been a great resurgence of Christian philosophy in the last 50 years. You don't have to take my word for that. This is a quotation by Quentin Smith, a prominent atheist philosopher, 12 books, 140 articles to his name. He wrote an article in the year 2000 in which he blasts his fellow atheist philosophers for having lost so much ground to Christian philosophers. He writes, "God is not dead in academia. He returned to life in the late 1960s and is now alive and well in his last academic stronghold, philosophy departments." And in that article, he says, this atheist philosopher, that if you took atheist philosophers who don't specialize in religion and you locked them in a room with theist philosophers, believers in God who do specialize in religion, and debates ensued, he suspects that one would have to conclude that the theists had the upper hand in every single argument or debate. And it's not just in philosophy that I don't think belief in God has been discredited. I would say that about sociology as well. Again, 50 years ago, things look somewhat differently. The scholars had bought into secularization theory. Okay, you know the idea. The idea is basically the more modern and technological the world becomes, the more secular it will become. And surely by 2014, belief in God would be wholly discredited. Okay, that's what they thought. By 1980, probably even a bit earlier, this theory was in shambles. Peter Berger was one of the leading sociologists who affirmed this theory. Today, he's completely abandoned it. At an academic conference in Miami in 2011, Berger said that he and almost everyone in his field gave up this theory simply because that is what the evidence demanded. He said that if you look at the contemporary world, the real situation is that most of the world is as religious as it ever was. You have enormous explosions of religion, he said, in the world. In fact, you can say every major religious tradition has been going through a period of resurgence in the last 30, 40 years or so. Anything but secularization. So my point is, both the discipline that studies the existence of God, philosophy, and the discipline which studies people's beliefs about the existence of God, sociology, have been very clear in their conclusion that belief in God has not been discredited. And not only has belief in God not been discredited, I would suggest that it hasn't even been close to being discredited. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I'm going to briefly try to outline 6 of them for you. The first is the who wants to be a millionaire reason. Say tonight doesn't go very well. I lose my job, and I start applying for lots of game shows. And eventually I wind up on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. And say I'm doing pretty well, a lot of money's at stake, and I get a question and the answer is not obvious to me. What should I do? I might use a lifeline. I might do a 50-50. I might poll the audience. Okay, this is not always decisive, but it's fairly reliable, and it tends to be more reliable the more people you poll, especially if those people have been thoughtful about the question. Well, the fact is that the vast, vast majority of people who have thought about the question of the existence of God throughout history and still today have come to the conclusion that God, at least one God, exists. Say you polled the audience in Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and 95% of the people all gave you the same answer, and yet you went with a different answer. Okay, you'd get blasted in the papers for irrationalism? Well, I think similarly, when we ask, has belief in God been discredited, we need to take seriously the fact that polling the audience from a global and historical perspective comes out massively in the favor of at least one God existing. The second reason that I think belief in God has not been discredited is the normalcy or the normality of the supernatural. Say I win Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? And as a result, I'm so thankful that tonight's performance got me fired, that I invite Will and Mark and Michael on a trip to Tahiti. And the four of us, we are on our way to Tahiti, but we get stranded on a deserted island. And say we're on this island, we're the only four on the island. It's a very small island, so I know we're the only four on the island. And say my signed copy of The God Delusion goes missing. And in its place, I find this anonymous note that says, "I'm sorry, my friend, I couldn't resist." Now, given the character of the three people with me, it might initially have seemed like it would be very unlikely for any one of them to have stolen from me. But if I can be confident that Will and Mark and Michael are the only three options, the probability of any one of them stealing from me is now actually quite significant. I want to suggest that something similar is true when we consider big picture explanations of the universe. There are only three. Explanation number one, God created the universe. Now we might just admit that's a pretty extraordinary option. But let's look at what the other alternatives are. Explanation number two, the entire universe just popped into existence from nothing, without any explanation at all. This is a very odd option. Okay, the physical stuff in our everyday lives doesn't generally just pop in and out of existence. If it doesn't now, why should we postulate that it did then? A third option, the universe has always existed, extending infinitely back in time. But this just pushes the oddness one step back. Now perhaps you can explain each part of the universe by some part of the universe that came before it, but you still have absolutely no explanation for why there's a universe at all. I think that too is a very odd option. These three options exhaust the relevant alternatives. No others have been suggested, and all three of them, I think, are quite odd. The conclusion, I think, is that we live in a miraculous world. I don't think there's any getting around that, whether you're a theist, an atheist, or an agnostic. We live in a miraculous world. Consider once more the position of atheist philosopher Quentin Smith. He says, "The fact of the matter is that the most reasonable belief is that we came from nothing, by nothing, and for nothing. We should acknowledge our foundation in nothingness and feel awe at the marvelous fact that we have a chance to participate briefly in this incredible sunburst that interrupts without reason the reign of non-being." Is this any less extraordinary of a belief to hold than belief in God? There's sometimes an assumption at the outset of discussions about the existence of God that the burden of proof for theism, for belief in God, is higher than the burden of proof for atheism, because God is such an incredible option. But I think the truth is, all we have are incredible options. You may have initially thought it was very unlikely that any of my three companions, Will or Mark or Michael, would steal from me. But if they were the only three options, then each of them would be a real suspect. I think likewise, if initially perhaps you thought God was a very unlikely option, but when you see that there are only three options and all of them are extraordinary, then that should help us to see God as a serious possibility as well. A third reason for taking belief in God seriously, I think, is because without God, there's no good reason to trust any of our beliefs. This is something that Charles Darwin worried about. Initially, C.S. Lewis had the concern. More recently, Alvin Plantinga has developed the argument, a Christian philosopher. He calls it the evolutionary argument against naturalism. here's the basic idea. If you're an atheist, it's common to believe that the sole guiding principle of human development is evolution, naturalistic evolution. But then a question arises. Why should we trust our cognitive faculties, our reasoning faculties, if they came to exist and function solely as a product of naturalistic evolution? Put crudely, evolution holds that species adapt genetically according to the principle survival of the fittest. Apart from any supernatural guidance, if there were no supernatural guidance, atheistic evolution would cause us to develop our reasoning faculties in ways that are conducive to survival, not truth. And these are not the same thing. Survival and truth are two different things. In fact, beliefs that are good for our survival are often not true. It was far more advantageous for my survival for me to believe that I would be rescued from the deserted island that I was on with Will and Mark and Michael. But it may have been obviously more true. It would have been obviously true that I wouldn't have been rescued. It may have been true that I would not have been rescued. It still would have been far more advantage for my survival if I thought I was going to be rescued. Survival and truth are not the same thing. And if you think that atheistic evolution is what determines human development, then you only have reason to believe that your beliefs are being developed in such a way that will be conducive for your survival, not in such a way that they will actually be true. And note that one's belief in atheism is no exception to that. So I think, ironically, the payoff of the argument is that if you believe in atheism, you may have very good reason not to believe in atheism. Because on your own assumptions, your beliefs, including your belief in atheism, is only designed to help you survive, not to help you actually gain the truth. The believer in God, on the other hand, I don't think has the same problem. He doesn't have the same reason for doubting his beliefs, because he will believe that God designed us through whatever processes he did so that our beliefs would not only be conducive to survival, but would also point us to the truth. A fourth reason that belief in God has not been discredited is that I think that Christians and believers in God have at times done a good job providing responses to some of the objections to belief. The problem of suffering, the idea that suffering disproves the existence of God, is perhaps the most major of the objections to belief in God. And I'm going to take that as an example and give you a few responses to that. I remember in one of the first significant conversations I had on this topic, it was with my Aunt Regina. Her son, my cousin, struggled with a severe mental disability, and she asked me a question about suffering. I started to spout on about some of my abstract philosophical speculations about why God might allow suffering. She listened to me very graciously. Then she turned to me and she said, "Vince, that doesn't speak to me as a mother." So I want to say at the outset, Will shared very vulnerably on this question. I really appreciate that. And I just want to say at the outset that people in this room are going to be coming from very different places with respect to our experience of suffering. I want to apologize in advance if anything I say comes across as if I'm not taking seriously any real-life suffering in your life. But this is a major objection to God. It's one that Will has raised as well, and so I want to at least begin to give a sense of what some of the responses might be. I'm going to go through them very quickly, but I'm going to briefly sketch 6 responses to that objection. The first one, I think there's a serious concern about whether atheism can account for the objective reality of evil that is supposed to motivate the objection in the first place. I recently came across an interview with Richard Dawkins. The interviewer said to him, Ultimately, your belief that rape is wrong is as arbitrary as the fact that we've evolved 5 fingers rather than 6. To which Dawkins responded, "You could say that, yeah." I guess you could say that. I certainly don't want to say that. I don't think it's rational to say that. And I think believing in the existence of an unchanging, loving God as the standard for morality gives us a way of not having to say that. That's a first response. A second response. One of the assumptions that's smuggled into this objection, that suffering disproves the existence of God, is this. If God has good reasons for allowing suffering, we should know what those reasons are. But why think that? Just to take one example, when a parent decides to move city, to pick up a family and move town, this can genuinely be extremely difficult for a young child. It may be experienced by that child as the worst thing that they could ever imagine happening. Perhaps some of you have had that experience. And yet, that does not mean that the parents did not have good reason for doing what they did or for allowing the move that they allowed. In fact, it's very possible in some situations that is precisely the good of the children that the parents have in mind when they're making that decision. You can see the analogy. If a parent's reasons are sometimes beyond what a human child can grasp, then why should we be surprised if God's reasons, if he exists, are sometimes beyond what we can fully grasp? If God is as great as many Christians claim he is, isn't that exactly what we should expect? And if it's what we should expect to find, if God does exist, then the fact that we find it can't be strong evidence that he doesn't exist. That approach is referred to as skeptical theism in the philosophical literature. A third approach, here are just the beginnings of it. It's typical to think of the problem of suffering, the objection from suffering, like this. We picture ourselves in this world with all of its suffering. Then we picture ourselves in a different world with far less suffering. And we think, surely God should have created me in this world, in the world with less suffering, in the world with minimal suffering. That's a reasonable thought. I think it's a thought that relies on a philosophical mistake. And I'm going to try to explain why. It relies on the assumption that it would still be you and me, as the individuals that we are in that other world, the world without the possibility of suffering, the world with far less suffering. And I think that that is highly controversial. I'm going to try to explain why. There was a pivotal moment early on in my parents' dating relationship. They were on their second date. Here they are. Thanks, Nathan. There they are. They're on their second date. They're standing at the end of that date on the Brooklyn Bridge. And my dad noticed a ring on my mom's finger. So he asked about it, and she said, "Oh, that's just some ring that one of my old boyfriends gave to me. I just wear it because I think it looks nice." And my dad said, "Yeah, it is nice. Let me see it." So my mom took the ring off, and she handed it to my dad, and my dad hurled it off the bridge. He watched it sink to the bottom of the East River. I like how you can tell which countries you're in. When I tell that in England, no one has any idea what's coming. When I tell that in America, it's sort of, we're just crazy enough to know, yeah, of course that's what you're going to do. You're just going to throw the ring right off the bridge. So people start laughing earlier. My dad said, "You're with me now. You won't be needing that anymore." And my mom loved it. I think it was sort of the clinching moment for them. Now, it was a pretty risky move that my dad made when he hurled the ring off of the Brooklyn Bridge. My mom loved it. But what if she hadn't? Okay, what if she had concluded, "Dad's nuts, I need to run back with the old boyfriend instead"? What would that have meant for me? Now, I don't know who that old boyfriend was. In fact, if you can believe it, 50 years later, my dad still tries to get my mom to tell him who that other guy was, and she still flatly refuses to say. But let's suppose, just hypothetically, that mom's old boyfriend was Sylvester Stallone. Now, you have to admit, in some respects, Stallone would make a pretty sweet dad. I doubt I'd have to worry about getting bullied at school if my dad was both Rocky and Rambo. But there's one problem with wishing that things had worked out between my mom and Sylvester. I never would have existed. Maybe some other child would have existed, and maybe he wouldn't have had to worry about getting bullied at school. But part of what makes me who I am, the individual that I am, is my beginning, the parents that I have, the sperm and egg that I came from, the combination of genes that's true of me. Asking, why didn't God create me in a world with far less suffering, in a very different world, is similar to saying, I wish my mom had married Sylvester Stallone or someone else. I'm sure my mom and that other guy would have had some very nice children, but I would not have been one of them. We often wish that we could just take some piece of suffering out of this world while keeping everything else the same. I don't think that's how things work. Changing anything changes everything and everyone. Why didn't God create a very different world? I think it depends on what God was after. It depends on what he was aiming for, what he values. And what if one of the things that he values greatly, is you and me and the people sitting next to you? Sometimes we wish that God had made a very different sort of world. I think when we wish that, we unwittingly, unknowingly, wish ourselves right out of existence. And so a question is raised. Could God have wronged us by creating us in this world and offering us eternal life, rather than creating a different world in which we never would have lived? That's the beginnings of the third response. A fourth response to this objection. I need your help with this one. Think of one of the greatest lives that you think has ever been lived. Maybe a life that you know from history, a life that you've read about, someone who you really admire. Okay, think about that life in detail. Think of the person's character and how it was formed. Think of the person's relationships. Think of his or her great triumphs, her sacrifices, their steadfastness for what was good and true. Think of all of that. And then try, hypothetically, to subtract all of the suffering from that person's life that you're thinking of. The suffering that shaped the culture and family that they were born into, the suffering that formed their character, the suffering they fought against, the suffering that they carried others through. Okay, what happened? Okay, all of a sudden, those lives that you thought of don't look anything like the lives that we were initially so inclined to celebrate. Without the possibility of significant suffering, practically every great true story in history would be false. No one would ever have made a significant sacrifice for anyone else. No great moments of forgiveness and reconciliation. No opportunities to stand for justice against injustice. No compassion, because nothing to be compassionate about. No courage, because no danger requiring courage. No heroes. No such thing as laying down one's life for another. Is it so obvious that God would create this world rather than our own? Okay, I'm not saying that that makes God's decision about creating a world that included the possibility of suffering easy. I'm not saying that. But I think it makes it very difficult. It's easy to get mad at the world that God has made. And I get that. I understand that. But I think it's also much harder to say the world that God should have made instead. A fifth response to this objection. I think it's important to remember that if God exists, our current perspective may not be the full perspective. The Bible says that the eternal life that God offers to every single person will be one where God will wipe every tear from our eyes, where there will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain. The challenge of suffering, I think, is in part a challenge of perspective. I gave this analogy last night, but imagine if aliens, philosophers like to use crazy analogies. Imagine if aliens managed to tap into a video feed of Earth, okay? But all they could see was the delivery room in the hospital when I was being born. And they watched as the doctors forcefully told my mom to do things that made her scream in pain. And then when she could take no more, they got out a knife and they cut right into her stomach. They took me out, blood everywhere, and even though my mom was reaching out for me and crying for me, they rushed me out of the room for some tests. Okay, what would the aliens think of the doctors? If all they saw was the first few moments of life, they might think that the doctors were utterly evil. Only from a fuller perspective would they be able to see that the doctors actually cared for my mother extremely well. And in fact, they saved my life. On the Christian understanding of reality, if that is true, what we currently see is literally just the first few moments of life, literally just the birthing process of human history. The vast, vast majority of our lives can be spent without death or mourning or crying or pain. This shift in perspective, I think, is also relevant to the objection that God should be more obvious. Okay, remember, from a Christian perspective, for the vast, vast majority of our lives, He will be more obvious. But in this small fraction of our lives, God is obvious enough, I think, for those who desire for Him to be in their lives. He's also not so obvious to force Himself upon any who don't desire for Him to be in their lives. I think in that way, He dignifies us with the freedom to choose whether or not we want Him in our life day to day. The final response I'll mention here, sixth response to this problem of suffering, I take this one from the atheist philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche. He wrote, "The gods justified human life by living it themselves. The only satisfactory response to the problem of suffering ever invented." Nietzsche is actually writing of the ancient Greeks here. He doesn't make the connection to Christianity. Okay, but as a Christian, I'm very pleased to agree with him and then to point to the cross where Jesus died, where I believe that God showed that there is no agony and there is no helplessness that we can experience in this life that He doesn't understand. Okay, the loving parent is not the one necessarily who never allows suffering in a child's life, but a loving parent is the one who is willing to come and suffer alongside their child. And in Christianity, this is exactly what we find, a God loving enough to come and suffer with us. This is only the briefest look at just a few of the responses to what I take to be the most major objection to belief in God. There are others as well. I have barely touched on the topic of free will, which is right at the center of a Christian response to this problem as well. I'm just finished a book on this question. It's going to be called Why Suffering? It's co-authored with Ravi Zacharias. If you're interested in more responses like this, I have a lot more to say in that book, which will be out in a few months. But hopefully just this brief sketch just gives you the beginnings of a glimpse at why it's the case that many philosophers have come to the conclusion that despite the fact that this is a serious objection, it does not discredit belief in God. Finally, I'm going to give you two more direct arguments for why I believe in God. Imagine me, Mark, Michael, and Will. We never get off the deserted island. Thankfully, Mark has a deck of cards, and so we sit down to play poker, and Mark gets 12 straight royal flushes to start us off. What should I think? What do you think? He's cheating. They're pretty quick to say you're cheating, Mark. That's right, Mark's cheating. Why? Because even if Mark's a very honest guy, it's so incredibly unlikely for someone to get 12 straight royal flushes in a row that someone must be messing with the cards. Over the last 35 years or so, the fine-tuning argument, a type of design argument for the existence of God, has suggested that we should come to a similar conclusion with respect to God. The universe that we live in, it could have taken many different forms. And scientists are coming to a consensus, not just Christian scientists, but scientists in general, that there are at least 25 different fundamental features of the universe that had to be precisely the way they are for life to be possible. Okay, not just human life and not just on the planet Earth, but any form of life anywhere in the universe. I'll give you just one example of the sort of thing they're talking about. Take the explosive force of the Big Bang, the initial start to the universe. Scientists are telling us that if that explosive force was just slightly stronger, particles would have dispersed so quickly and gotten so far from each other that all we could have gotten would have been cold, simple molecules. Everything would have dispersed into thin air. Nothing like the sort of complex chemistry that would be required for any form of life. If that explosion of the Big Bang was just the slightest bit weaker, gravity forces it to collapse back in on itself almost immediately, with nothing like the sort of time that would be required for life to emerge. The scientists are saying that the percentage difference that you could have with just that single feature, with life still being possible, the percentage difference would be a 0 followed by a period, followed by 59 zeros, followed by a 1. That's the sort of probabilities we're talking about. And the scientists are saying that there's dozens of these features that had to be exactly as they were. How are we to explain these amazing coincidences? Okay, these royal flushes turning up hand after hand in the universe. I think we should come to a rational conclusion that someone is cheating. Someone got their hands on the cards and tinkered with the system. That the data should come to be the way it is, based on chance alone, is so incredibly unlikely that we're forced to the conclusion that someone loaded the deck, that someone designed the system. And what could we infer about that someone? If they played the role of fine-tuning the universe, well, that person would have to be very old to be there at the beginning. They'd have to be very powerful to actually fine-tune these constants. They'd have to be very intelligent to know exactly how they had to be fine-tuned. They'd have to be interested in rational life that they could be in relationship with. So I think the argument brings us to a point of saying it's very rational to posit that this data could be explained if there's someone in the universe that's very old, very powerful, very intelligent, and interested in rational life. The final reason I'm going to mention for why I think belief in God has not been discredited is the resurrection of Jesus. I didn't think there could be evidence for such a thing when I was a skeptic and I was looking into this. I was blown over to find how strong I found the scholarly case for this to be. I think it's strong for a number of reasons. I'm just going to focus on one of those reasons, which focuses on a passage in the Bible in Paul's letter to Corinth, 1 Corinthians chapter 15. This is what Paul writes in his letter. He says, "For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas," that's Peter, "and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all of the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also." Remarkably, scholars have come to a consensus that this creed, which claims that Jesus, after his death, appeared, risen physically, to more than 500 people at once and to many others at many times, over a several-week period that this is an early creed and that it goes back to within a couple of years at most of the actual events. This has become the scholarly consensus, even among the strongest critics of Christianity. So my question is, what can account for this? What can bridge the gap between the history of Christianity, part 1, the apostles having deserted Jesus when he was arrested, dejected and defeated after the man they hoped would be the Messiah, the long-awaited Redeemer that was supposed to become a powerful king, rescue the Jewish people from Rome, reign forever, died. Should have been movement over. And then the history of Christianity, part 3, which saw these very same apostles and countless others worship Jesus as a God, insist that they had seen him after his death, and give up their lives rather than deny him. Pliny the Younger, a Roman governor at the time in what's now northwest Turkey, he wrote this. He said, "I ask them if they are Christians, and if they admit it, I repeat the question a second and a third time, with a warning of the punishment awaiting them. If they persist, I order them to be led away for execution." Those who walked this earth with Jesus went from mourning that their leader had been defeated and being too scared to even be present at his crucifixion, to accepting their own deaths by torture and execution rather than deny that Jesus is God. And all they had to do was deny it in word, to just say, "Fine, Pliny, I don't believe, I'm not a Christian," and then go home to their homes and continue to worship him in private. But even for their lives, they could not deny him. How could every one of them have been so convinced that Jesus was the God that he claimed to be? Okay, it doesn't add up. Something happened. The bare facts of history demand so. The Christian response is the miraculous resurrection of Jesus. That's how the Christian fills that gap between the history of Christianity part 1 and the history of Christianity part 3. If that is not your answer, and here I think is the crucial point, then the gap remains. The bare minimum facts of undisputed history demand that something extraordinary happened in the lives of the apostles, of Jesus' followers. If it wasn't the resurrection, what was it? People used to think that that something might have been legendary development over time. Okay, you know the idea. You say something to the person next to you, and they say the same thing to the person next to them, but by the time it gets to this side of the room, it sounds completely different. That was a more popular theory in the early 1900s. But what I've showed you about that creed from 1 Corinthians 15 completely undermined that theory. It's clear that the believers in Jesus believed that he had risen and appeared to them on many occasions within, at most, a couple of years of Jesus' actual death. Studies show it takes 2 or 3 generations for significant legendary development to make its way into a text. There was no time for such a thing. And after legendary development theory, you really have to start straining to come up with a naturalistic theory for how we can explain this gap between the history of Christianity part 1 and part 3. In fact, I think it's fair to say that in the scholarly literature, no other theory other than the resurrection itself has earned any degree of credibility. Probably the most influential British philosopher of religion of the last 50 years or so is a guy named Richard Swinburne. Before retiring, he held the head post in Oxford, and in 2003, he published a book called The Resurrection of God Incarnate. And in that book, he concludes that on the available evidence today, he says that his conclusion is that it's 97% probable that Jesus truly, physically, miraculously rose from the dead, okay, proving that he was the God that he claimed to be. Now, Swinburne recognizes we can't take the exact percentage too seriously. Okay, he just means that as an estimation. He works with probability theory, so he plugs in numbers at each point in the argument. Still, though, the fact that someone of his intellectual credibility can make that claim in print, have it be published by Oxford University Press, and then ably defend it at top academic conferences all around the world, as I've seen him do, I think that speaks to the fact that the case for the Christian faith intellectually is very strong, once again symbolizing that belief in God has not been discredited. Okay, myself, I was doing my undergraduate studies when I came to realize that for the first time. And when I did, it caused me to have to question whether it was really intellectual obstacles in my own life, this is me personally, that were keeping me from God, or perhaps something else. In my personal experience, I think it was fair to say that for me, I was hiding in my heart something that Friedrich Nietzsche was bold enough to put to paper. If there were gods, how could I bear not being a god? That's where I was. I don't know if maybe there are some people here tonight who maybe have been in a place where you've wished you could believe in God, but there's been an assumption that it couldn't be intellectually respectable, it couldn't be rational, there couldn't be evidence that would make that a legitimate thing to do. And I want to say tonight that that is not the case, that there is more than enough evidence to take a rationally justifiable step of faith and trust in Jesus Christ. And my experience is that if we're willing to take that step, that amazingly, the same God who fine-tuned the whole universe, who rose from the dead, is interested in the details of our lives, cares for each one of us, and I would say loves each one of us so much that he would come and give his very life for us. I'm just ending, and I think the last thing I want to say is just to offer an apology. I've really enjoyed spending time with Will, with some of the other atheists who are in the room. I'm looking at Chris. Chris, am I getting your name right? Chris was challenging me with questions after last night's talk. I was up thinking about them as I went to bed. I had a conversation with my wife last night on the phone where I was putting some of your questions to her, and we were talking those things through. This is the sort of dialogue that I think is just so good. And one of the things I've found over the last couple days as I've interacted with people, several of the people I've interacted have said that the questions and the doubts that they have thought about, they began in the church. They were members of the church, they were believers, and it was in the context of the church when doubts arose and when questions arose that they felt those things were not welcome. And that when that was the case, the church was no longer a community in which they were welcome and which they could wrestle through these questions and these doubts in a legitimate way. I love the church. It's my family. I'm so grateful to be a part of it. I also want to put my hand up and say, I want to own that. And on behalf of my family, the church, to say that so often we don't live up to the love that Jesus has called us to. If that has been your experience of being within the church and finding yourself with doubts and questions that were not welcomed, I just want to say I don't think that's Christ-like. I don't think that's the church at its most healthy. And I would love if more of these conversations could take place, not where we just have to have an event where we sort of need to bring everyone together for a special occasion, but that it would be normal, whether it's at your society meeting or in the church that I or many of you worship, that it would be normal for atheists and Christians to be together talking about these questions. So I just want to offer that apology if that's been your experience. Certainly my hope is that you would give us Christians and the church a second chance to earn your trust when it comes to dealing with these questions and these sorts of difficult discussions. I'm going to be at a church preaching on Sunday. So is Michael. If anybody wants to come, let me know. I'm going to be doing a session before the service on a Sunday, specifically talking with Christians about how do we deal when people have doubts and have questions? How do we respond to those questions in a way that's constructive? And actually, if anyone's here and maybe you're an atheist, maybe you're an agnostic, but you think, I could have something to add to that. I've had an experience in the church where that was not handled well and it pushed me out. Well, come grab me afterwards. Maybe we'll go together. You know, we can lead that session together. You could give us a perspective, which would be really helpful. So thanks, Will. Thanks, everyone, for listening. It's been really great to be here, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Vitale. I'd like to go immediately into question and answer. We've gone a little over. I'd like you to indulge us with a little more of your time for the question and answer period. We have 2 microphones here in the middle. We'd like for those that would have questions of Will to line up on the left, and for those that would have questions of Dr. Vitale to line up on the right. And as you're lining up behind the microphones, I'd like to call the speakers up to the front. Joining Dr. Vitale is Michael Ramsden. Michael Ramsden has been the European Director of RZIM Trust since its foundation in 1997. He grew up in the Middle East, returning to the UK to work investing money for the Lord Chancellor's Department and to study. Lecturer in Christian Apologetics at Wycliffe Hall, Oxford University, where his main involvement is with the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics. Joining William Hua is Michael Speck. Michael Speck is an assistant professor and coordinator of the Paralegal Studies program at TCC. He holds a BA and MA in philosophy from the University of Oklahoma and a JD from Southern Illinois University. In the decade before joining the faculty at TCC, Michael practiced law in Oklahoma City and taught humanities and philosophy as an adjunct instructor at Rose State College. Again, I would like to, like everyone with the question, to remember to be respectful for our speakers. Use your opportunity at the mic to ask one question. And remember, this is not the time for you to give your own personal point of view. Be respectful also for those we have, so get as many questions in as possible. Remember that at the reception immediately following our session today, there will be time for dialogue. With that, I'll start with the gentleman over on the left for the first question.
Now you have to figure me out. I have to look at my flow sheet here. Now, Dr. Vince Vitale, the first response to good responses to objections you listed was that atheism cannot account for objective morality, and we should not expect to know the reasons for suffering. And that brought me to Isaiah 55:9, which I've seen you cite before, which is, for as the heavens are higher than yours, so are my ways than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. And wouldn't that seem to imply then that God does not make sense to humans in some sort of way?
Yeah, good question. Thank you. Yeah, that's helpful, and it helps me to clarify. What I wanted to say, and I don't know if I made this qualification or not, was that we shouldn't be surprised when we don't fully grasp God's reasons. In my own life, I find that when I think about the suffering that I've been through and my family members have been through, I can look back on some of it and say, okay, I can understand why a God might have allowed that, and I can understand how that was redeemed in the story of my life or in my family's life, and that actually I wouldn't wish that out of my life story now. But then there's other suffering that I look back on and I just think that seems pointless. I can't understand that at all. And I think if we have a God who we can understand to a significant extent, but who also is well beyond us, then perhaps that's not so surprising if that's what we find. If we find that some of the things that we've been through we can understand, other things we simply can't. And in my experience is that the longer I live, the more I can sometimes reflect back and things that perhaps for years didn't make any sense. I can say, actually, I can find some meaning in that now that I couldn't earlier. And my hope would be that in the context of an eternal existence, more of those things would continue to make sense, and God would be able to make meaning out of more and more of the things that I've been through. So I want to say that yes and no, that yeah, I think God is way beyond us, but I also think that he's knowable to us. And I think that is in particular the case because he came down and lived a human life among us. I feel that what I can know about God, because he lived a human life and I can relate to him as a person to person, is so far beyond what I might be able to understand about him if he was just high in the sky. I hope that helps a bit.
This gentleman here.
Questions for Mr. Pois. Hi, Mr. Pois. I really appreciated what you had to say and the emotion that you brought. I mean, you really touched my heart. I was actually expecting to hear all scientific stuff from you. I totally appreciated how you brought in, the pictures of Einstein and Sir Isaac Newton. I love physics. But you had this statement, and one of your big things, your big pushes, I was very interested in, because you said, can God be seen or heard? So here's my question to you. Can Sir Isaac Newton and Einstein be seen or heard? Okay, that's my first. And then there's a second part. You also said that how come there's 4,000 variations in the Bible? I'll bet you any money there's 4,000 variations of the words of Sir Isaac Newton and what he meant, and of Einstein especially and what he meant. How can we know what they said? You're a good guy, though.
This
I like
is getting
you.
interesting. I was only joking about the Who Wants to Be a Millionaire thing.
Thanks for the 2 questions. Let me make sure I get these questions correct. Hold on, I'll try to rephrase it. The first one, because you threw 2 curveballs.
How do we know that there's a Sir
And
Isaac Newton and a Einstein? Can't see him or hear him now.
Right, you're exactly right.
The
And
evidence.
I went overboard on, obviously all the time, I wanted to talk about the ways in which made sense of the world. What I wanted to stress, though, is that perception is just one of many. And yes, you're correct. We have their writings. We don't know. To be honest, don't know if there are textual variations. My problem is not so much if there are textual variations. There are textual variations among a lot of books. But what I was getting at was that if this is true about God, that he is almighty, he is all-knowing, and he is all-loving, and he wanted me to make sense of him, what would I expect to see? Would I expect to see these variations? And to me, I wouldn't expect to, because in Einstein and Newton, I recognize that they are not all-knowing and that they're not all-powerful, and they cannot stop their work from being forged. They can't stop these things. In my opinion, as it is so defined in God, he could. Now, how do I know that they existed? I know based upon we have photographs of Einstein. I suppose somebody could have gone through and doctored all of these, but again, as I said, I'm making some assumptions in life. I assume that I exist, and I assume that my perceptions are sometimes accurate, and from that, I can at least build somewhat of a pretty reliable worldview. So I'm 99.99% certain that Einstein and Newton existed, because we do have their writings. And they may contradict each other. And that's fine, but that's not what I would expect from someone who is perfect. Do I answer your question, or let me know if I
No,
answer?
you have. I'd just like to say I think the Bible's a fantastic photograph of God.
Thank you.
This gentleman over here. Yes, you, yes.
Not sure who to address this question, because I really would appreciate both people answering. But when I was a college student, I was actually at a Christian university also, and was hit by a lot of liberal professors with the JEPD theories. At the same time, I was given Josh McDowell's books had just come out, and so I looked at that. And so anyway, you all didn't really particularly. Especially the second speaker didn't really go into that, but do you? So I guess I would address him first. But you didn't. What would be your synopsis of looking at that data from 2 different sides, and do you just have kind of a brief answer of how you wrestled with the 2 sides there?
The data, say which data you're talking about.
Well, you're looking at the first set of data, or the first set of observations of the Bible, from the 18th century JEPD theorist, and then on the second hand, you have some more modern people who have tried to answer that, like Josh McDowell and his books on evidence that demands a verdict, and then he has a book, an entire book on the JEPD theories, and so then and that ties into the questions, about the inconsistencies, the supposed inconsistencies of the Bible. So then, is there a reason why have you looked at both sides, which I'm sure you have, and is there a reason why you lean more toward one viewpoint than the other on the validity of the scripture?
Okay,
Does that make
Vince
sense?
has passed me the microphone, which is a bad move. So let me just say a few things.
Uh-huh.
I mean, Oxford has a fairly, some people consider radical theology department in many ways, in the sense that the majority of the professors would be atheists. To be honest, I'm not sure how many would actually agree with some of the stuff put up in the earlier part, simply because of quite a lot of scholarship and discovery that's been made in the last 15 years through the nature of the manuscripts of the Bible. So there is still discussion and there is still some debate. I know over here in the States, Bart Ehrman and Karen Armstrong have published books that have got a wide dissemination. Some people sometimes say, I know to the Oxford Scholarly Department, including the atheist professors, why don't you publish against it? Because I know they have very strong disagreements from an academic point of view with them. Not because they're Christians, but they just think it's not good scholarship. And the trouble is sadly with a lot of these debates that you're referring to, the books that get the wide circulation, the wide reading, aren't necessarily would be considered to be good scholarship, and the reason why a lot of people in Oxford haven't bothered to publish against it is they think it's not worth publishing against. In other words, the case isn't strong enough to deserve that kind of high-level academic answer. Now, the debate maybe over here in the US, I don't know, is for some reason slightly different. What I would say is one of the big changes over the last sort of 30 years that has been quite significant to deal with the idea of what's called redaction criticism, where the idea there is, well, look, things have been said and then just changed and edited. The guy who headed up something called the Jesus Seminar over here, which is a fairly liberal group of theological scholars, made the comment that probably within the first few weeks of the alleged resurrection, the gospel that the church preached was that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, that he was crucified according to the scriptures, and rose again on the third day. Now, he goes on to say that they were wrong from day one. So the guy who headed up the Jesus Seminar said, look, they were wrong from day one. I disagree with what they said, but that's what they said right from the beginning. Now, what that does is that effectively knocks some of these other hypotheses on the head, because the argument at this point isn't that the message is being changed over time. The argument now is, well, actually, they were just simply wrong. And even right, and I don't know how, as a matter of fact, one of the scholars in that movement claims that this is what they were saying within 36 hours. Now, how on earth they came to that conclusion, I've got no idea. I'm not persuaded by that. I think, to be honest, even 2 weeks is very surprised to see former head of the Jesus Seminar making that claim. I think that's very early to push it. But even still, all it does show is that there's a lot of evidence to show that's what everyone concluded and said from the first day. Now, it doesn't make it true, but it does then deal with some of the argument about, well, has this been edited down through? It's true about the number of variations. There are a very, very large number. The question is how many of those are significant. One or two of the significant ones were referred to, and those certainly bear a lot more discussion. But a lot of them are so minor as to be small, and the numbers have recently changed. There's been quite a lot of scholarship actually coming out of Cambridge University the last couple of years. Some of the variant readings that were admitted to what are called the textual apparatus on the Bible in the 60s and 70s on closer inspection turned out not to be textual variants at all. And actually they've been removed from what's called the textual apparatus, which is just a commonly globally used thing when you're looking at the text. In other words, actually there are fewer variations than we actually thought there were, as some of that scholarship's been revisited. So, personally I have a lot of confidence in the nature of the text. I don't think there's anything significantly that really fundamentally changes the meaning. I remember reading one of Bart Ehrman's books and being a little bit disappointed. The title of the book seemed to suggest that major changes have been made, but actually when you read the fine print and come to the conclusion, he actually says in the book, no major changes have been made. But I guess books that get published with titles like that don't sell as well as ones that maybe have slightly more attention-grabbing headlines. I mean, one of the reasons I'd just love to see more discussion about these things is very often the things that grab the media aren't where the real debate is. I don't know I don't know if the guy who was at Tulsa University who interviewed me yesterday was here. He said something very interesting. He was someone from here asked the question, "Why did you leave one radio station and go to another?" And he said, "Well, I was involved in the news, and I was just simply tired of having to create a headline of the latest breaking urgent news that you have to hear, and somehow beef up a story to make it into a story when actually it wasn't one." Sometimes when meaningful discussion stops and all that's happening in these salvos taking place, it's normally the most extreme voices that get the microphone, and the more sensationalist the claim, the more press that you're going to get, and that isn't necessarily always reflective of where the scholarship is. But I mean, that would be just some of my thoughts to the question.
Will and Michael, would you like to respond to the question?
Yeah, actually, and I'll give credit where credit is due. Bart Ehrman, he's a fantastic biblical scholar. So for one, let's get that out of the way. And he's absolutely correct, that there are. It doesn't necessarily change the theology in too much of a degree. I mean, we've got Mark 1:41. We don't know if Jesus was indignant or if he was compassionate towards the leper. That can change a few minds, but that's not entirely seriously problematic. My concern, though, was simply with the fact that there are alterations, that there are people changing things around for their biases. We have really no idea, to be honest. So when I approach this problem, and when I approach the problem of the biblical criticisms, I have to ask myself, what would I expect to see if God had a message worthy of conveying that would save my soul? Now, this whole thing is not a deal breaker, and Bart Ehrman admits this. And what I want to say is, you're absolutely right. He puts this great title on it, and in the very back of the book, it's not that big of a deal. And he even admits that it's going through all this that didn't necessarily make him not believe. The point at which I was coming from is simply that I do have a problem reconciling that this would happen. And there are some other variations, and again, I pointed out too, I think I was going to bring up another one, which is talking about the language that Jesus spoke, and then the double entendres we see in the book of John. But
just to kind of frame the discussion a bit, I mean, in a sense, I think, we both want to say if God exists, and if he, is that right? Stand up is helpful? Okay. I think what we're agreeing on in both sides is that if God exists, and if he wanted to communicate a message through a book, then he would in some supernatural way protect that book from error. And I think perhaps the disagreement is, would he do so in such a way that there would be no variations whatsoever in the different manuscripts that we have, or would he do so in such a way that, as it seems we're agreeing, the sort of main overall message and the theology is protected and is clear down through the generations? And I think perhaps, Michael and I are saying that that's what's most important to us, that it seems like the text has been protected, if there is a God, in such a way that we can say with quite a bit of confidence now that what was initially believed is what has been communicated to us.
I would summarize my thoughts like this. I agree. I don't think it matters. You can take the text on its merits on its own without actually necessarily delving into the authorship, because that borders, frankly, on a fallacy to discredit the author. Well, either the propositions are true or they're not. So if the author or authors are unknown and inconsistent, sure, that makes for some interesting discussions, but ultimately the propositions from the single or various authors remain, and you have to take those on their face.
This gentleman to my right.
Vince, I have a question for you. Can be answered by you or Michael, well, or anyone, doesn't matter. It sounded to me like when you were talking about proofs for God, that one of the last reasons you gave, or the last reason, was the resurrection of Jesus. And it sounded like what you were saying, that because early on the followers of Christ were unwilling to deny him, even to the point of sparing their own lives. Did I kind of got that right? So my question is, surely there are other faiths, Islam would be one of them, just to be honest, who would have followers who were quite willing to lay down their lives for what they believed, either by claim or what they witnessed. How would you say what you're saying is different in any measure from those?
Sure, yeah. Great question. I think it's very true. We see in all sorts of areas that people will sometimes die for something. Normally people don't die for a lie. And I think in the Christian faith, one of the things I was wanting to say is that what we know is that very soon after Jesus' death, there were many people who claimed that they had seen him risen from the dead. Okay, physically, miraculously. We have people who were his friends and people who were his enemies in different regions, independent sources are testifying to it, groups of 10 individuals, a group of 500. We have all of this data of these appearance stories that happened over a 7-week period or so. And how can we account for that was my question. The resurrection is one way to account for that. And my challenge was, if that's not how you account for that, then the gap still remains. There's still this eruption of Christianity, which doesn't make sense if it's just the fact that this man who they thought would reign forever died. That should have been the end of the story, but it wasn't, and there were all these claims of appearances from Jesus having risen. Now, it could be the case that despite 2,000 years of historical speculation and scholarship, there's simply no other plausible hypothesis for how to account for that. I think that would be quite unreasonable. Of course, if you discount the existence of a miracle from the beginning, of course you're going to come to the conclusion that a miracle didn't happen. But what I'm wanting to say is that if you don't discount the existence of a miracle from the beginning, this is the sort of evidence that could lead you to believe that it could be likely that one actually occurred. Now, somebody might want to say, well, maybe this is the most elaborate conspiracy of all time. Somehow they all got together, even though they didn't necessarily have a motivation for putting this conspiracy together, because they would have had every reason to think that they'd be killed as Jesus was killed for the claim that he made. Instead, they all got together and they made this conspiracy where they're going to claim that they've seen him in all these different places at all these different times. That's where I find it really unfathomable to think that they would have died for it. If they made it up, then why would you die for it? And if it wasn't true, they would have known, because they were the ones who claimed that these things had really happened.
Okay, we're running a little late. Let's do 2 more questions, but I want to say this. There's a card put in everyone's chair. You can ask your questions there, turn it in, and someone will respond to you. Also, if you want more information about tonight's event, please contact me, tell me more, and we'll reach out to you with that. And so with that, let's do, again, 2 more questions.
So I posed like a variation of this question to your colleagues from RZIM last week, but I think the question was maybe a little bit poorly constructed, so I'm going to try again this evening. So the Gospels and the writings of Paul are kind of foundationed by the idea that the Garden of Eden account, is something that's factual, something that really did happen. So I can't really think of a good reason to believe that actually happened. To me, it reads a lot more like mythology than it does something that is factual, right? So, if you factor that back in, you had up there earlier your big question mark where you were trying to fill in the gap of, the history of Christianity part 2. When you factor that in, I think the probability of your explanation being the correct one pretty much drops to 0. And so I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Sorry, say that again. Given the fact that there's a assumption that the garden as portrayed in a literal sense at the beginning of Genesis, including Adam and Eve as the first two persons, is assumed in Paul's writings, that then is enough to discredit. Because I guess part of where I want to push back is say, okay, let's treat that, but maybe that's a discrete issue, because even if Paul was wrong about that, if you were, let's say you're right about that, that wouldn't necessarily discount the fact that this creed, which he had inherited, which was very early in dating, still had these extraordinary claims which would require accounting for.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is if the fall didn't happen, then that means that we're exactly the way that God intended us for us to be. And so there wasn't a fall, we didn't screw things up, and so there was no reason for Jesus to come in the first place. So it just kind of all starts to unravel if you just look at Genesis as mythology rather than a fact that can be a solid foundation for the rest of Scripture.
I see. Thanks, Chris. That's helpful. I'll say a couple things. I don't know if Michael, you might want to add as well. You might not have time. Various Christians have different theories about the fall. I think whichever specific theory you take on that, what you will believe is that at some point, God created human persons, people with a moral awareness, people in his image, and that those first people were the ones who committed the first sin, and that the then ongoing consequences of that first sin were quite disastrous. I think that could be the case. So Richard Swinburne, who I mentioned in my talk, he actually understands that on a kind of evolutionary approach. So he thinks about the first human persons coming to exist. Although he's a believer in God, he thinks about the first human persons coming to exist through an evolutionary process. He thinks at some point in that evolutionary process, God infused those people with a rationality and a sense of morality and his image such that they were the first human persons. And then he thinks that those first human persons were the ones who fell. Now, other Christians in a more traditional approach to that question wouldn't necessarily think of human persons coming to exist in that evolutionary way, but maybe created in a more direct way. One of the questions I would want to raise is, from our perspective today, should we expect the evidence to look differently if it were the case that God just gradually created beings from the first amoeba to what we are today? Or if at some point along a process of development, he created certain beings more directly and put them in a certain region or garden, and then they fell from that state. From our vantage point, looking back, I'm not sure that my evidence would look differently if he created in one way or the other. So I don't think that just based on sort of my scientific evidence, I'm able to look back and say, God must have created human persons in this way or that way, and he must have either put them in a garden or not, and they must have fallen or not in this way or that way. So for me, it was that I came to this belief about the resurrection of Jesus. That helped me to believe that Jesus must have been who he claimed to be. And then I looked at how Jesus treated the scriptures of his day. That helped me to have confidence in the scriptures that I was reading, and it's on those theological assumptions that start with my initial claim about the resurrection of Jesus that I then trust what the Bible has to say about the development of humanity and their fall. But looking back from just a scientific perspective, from here I wouldn't necessarily expect to see things differently one way or the other.
Will? One of the things I had in my presentation was I was going to quote from Christian apologist Matt Slick. There's, the omnipotence paradox. And I wanted, basically, it wasn't to suggest that God can exist because of this omnipotent paradox. what I was trying to do was talk about language, how we couldn't make sense of God. And in so doing, basically you're right. There are a lot of things which we cannot understand. If God exists, I would agree he's ineffable. We cannot describe him by words. But one of the points I was wanting to make, and I'm sorry, this is part of my presentation, so I want to quote him, is that he, in explaining the way that omnipotence paradox, he writes that his omnipotence is not something independent of his nature. It is a part of his nature. God has a nature, and his attributes operate within that nature and does anything and everything else. God can only do those things which are consistent with his nature. He cannot lie because it is against his nature to do so. And I would be in agreement with him on this, which is why I think that the omnipotent paradox fails. Because it doesn't mean that there's a contradiction. It just means that there's something out there that we don't understand. What I got from that, though, and I think he's absolutely right, the nature of existence is that something is itself and it's not what it's not. And it has essential qualities and essential properties from which we cannot deviate, because to do so would be inconsistent with our nature. And so we are told that we have a sinful nature. But if we cannot act inconsistently with our nature, then how could we have gotten this sinful nature? Because in regards to the fall of man, we are told that here's a guy who lacks the knowledge because he hasn't yet eaten from the tree of knowledge. So he lacks the capacity to understand that what he's doing, defying God, is wrong. He lacks this knowledge. But in order to have defied God, which is a sin, he would have had to have had a sinful nature. At least insofar as I understand it. Because if we could act inconsistent with our natures, we would be, one possibility is that we could be sinless. But we know that, for one, I don't exactly take the term that, call it sin. I think we're faulty, and if you want to call something being faulty or imperfect a sin, then so be it. I think we're just arguing semantics at this point. But that's the one thing I've been trying to figure out is how could have a being acted and operated outside of his nature? To me, at least, I can appreciate that that story is, insofar as I understand it, just a myth of people trying to make sense of the world. But it comes into play, if that story's not real, then did Jesus die for a metaphor? Or did he die for our sins? And if he died for our sinful nature, how did we acquire it except for that God created us this way?
Last question.
First of all, I wanted to say thank you for some really intelligent and intriguing observations. Dr. Vitale, my question is directed towards you. Given the context of the times, the obvious shift in morality, the liberal theologies abounding, in your estimation, from your experience, in your travels and your studies, what would you say is the biggest threat to the church? And actually, the question could be directed to either one of you, but in your estimation, what would you say is the biggest threat to the church right now?
Wow, big question. Thanks for that. Well, there's a lot to choose from, but I think one big threat to the church is we're often not reaching people at a young enough age. I've heard some of my colleagues speak about this, and they say, a generation ago, if you're in a Christian home, you were probably, Christian to the time you were 18 or until you were out of the house, and, if you started sort of dealing with people's questions and doubts around university age time or later, then you were really dealing with them at the time in which those doubts were arising. I'm finding more and more, I think, and Michael can speak to this better than I can, that as I travel around, the sorts of really good questions that Will is posing and that others here are posing are arising earlier and earlier for people. You have young teenagers who are asking really reasonable, difficult questions. And oftentimes, I think, especially in that young age group, they can almost sometimes be given the sense of to have those questions or to have those doubts must mean that your faith is not strong enough. My experience as a philosopher, I came to faith through philosophy. I've lived out my faith as a philosopher, and I've really experienced it as an act of worship. You know, for me, it's been part of that relational process of getting to know God, of no question being off limits, of being able to ask him the hard questions and not be worried that I'm going to offend him by asking the hard questions, but be able to wrestle through those things as a community and come to a deeper and deeper knowledge of him in a way that, you know, for me has been life transformative. I think people are starting to ask those questions at an earlier and earlier age, and I think the church needs to be ready, as Will put it, to give a good response to those questions, even when adolescents are quite young.
I just wanted to point out that kind of well, you know, give me a hard time, but I think they got more questions than we did, and I'm not jealous, but I kind of feel like, I think you said.
I tried.
Okay. So, atheist community of Tulsa, shame on you for not listening to Mark and taking up both sides. But otherwise, no, I'm sure they'll do a tremendous job answering questions.
Can I just speak a word? Hello, can I speak just a word?
Sir, we're going to conclude. You'll have time. The speakers are gracious enough to stay afterward and answer questions and have further dialogue. I'm going to end it here. We've gone well over. Again, I'd like to thank the sponsors that made tonight's event possible. We do have questions in the back. I would encourage everyone to fill out your event card with comments and questions and hand it out to the table in the back. Michael will be speaking tomorrow night at Foolish Things Coffee House at 7 a.m. If you'd like to hear more, you can come out then, and I encourage you to. 7 p.m., not 7 a.m. tomorrow night. Okay. We want them to sleep in. So anyway, again, I appreciate everyone come out. I apologize we couldn't get all of your questions answered. The speakers will stay afterward, and you can ask them questions. Thank you very much.